Every morning the tall glass building came alive with rushing footsteps, ringing phones, and hurried voices of men and women in neat suits. But hidden in the quiet corners of this busy place was a woman in a simple uniform who walked with steady steps and lowered eyes. She was the maid, someone no one really noticed, though she carried her duties with care, wiping tables, polishing floors, and making sure the shine of the building matched its reputation. And beside her that day walked her young daughter, a school bag pressed against her chest, and curious eyes scanning everything around her. Though the busy executives rarely looked her way, too occupied with documents, coffee, and meetings that seemed far more important than the presence of a quiet child in the background. Yet the girl noticed everything: how the guards greeted some people but ignored others, how the large screens in the lobby displayed news of upcoming business deals, how nervous smiles floated between men in ties as if secrets lay behind them. And though her small hands clutched her books, her ears were open, catching fragments of conversations as she followed her mother. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfumes mixed with cleaning spray, and while most believed this was just another ordinary morning, the girl felt something different, a strange heaviness in the atmosphere, as if everyone was preparing for something big. And she could sense her mother's worry too, though the woman said nothing, only moved faster with her cart of supplies, trying not to get in anyone's way. But in this grand building full of sharp voices and polished shoes, the quiet presence of a maid and her daughter would soon matter more than anyone could imagine. For while the executives brushed past without a glance, a hidden story was already waiting to unfold, and the first clue of it rested silently in the watchful eyes of a child who saw what no one else cared to notice. The morning sun reflected off the tall glass windows as the building hummed with a strange kind of energy, louder and sharper than usual. For inside the executive floor, the air was thick with excitement, whispers of victory, and the promise of unimaginable success. A deal worth $500 million was about to be sealed, and everyone from the assistants to the senior directors walked with quickened steps, speaking in low but eager tones about how this contract would change the future of the company forever. While in the grand boardroom the long polished table was already set with crisp folders, silver pens, and screens that flashed charts and numbers meant to impress anyone who looked at them. And at the head of the table sat the CEO, his voice carrying the weight of pride as he told the gathered team that today would mark a new era, the kind of day that people would talk about for years, a day that would lift them above competitors and prove their strength to the entire industry. Yet beneath the polished surface of this celebration, within the stacks of documents and contracts piled neatly before them, something dangerous lurked, something carefully hidden behind legal phrases and complicated numbers, something no one in the room seemed to notice because their eyes were clouded by dreams of glory and profit. The executives leaned back in their leather chairs, some smiling confidently, others whispering about the bonuses they might soon receive, while outside the boardroom glass walls, secretaries moved briskly, phones rang non-stop, and the sound of heels clicked across the marble floors, all carrying the rhythm of a company on the verge of triumph. But far below their confidence, a thin layer of unease existed, one that no one acknowledged aloud, for they had already decided that the deal was too big to question, too important to delay, and so the signatures were expected to fall like dominoes, smooth and unstoppable, even though the truth lay waiting between the lines of the paperwork, invisible to those blinded by ambition, yet dangerously clear to someone who had been quietly watching from the sidelines. The young girl sat quietly in the corner of the hallway, her small figure almost hidden behind a tall plant, a stack of school books resting on her lap as she pretended to be busy with her reading. But her eyes and ears were far more alert than her hands, turning the pages. She was used to these afternoons, waiting for her mother to finish her cleaning duties in the big offices, and while most children her age might have grown restless or bored, she had developed a habit of listening to the sounds around her, paying attention to voices, footsteps, and stray conversations that drifted through the air. And today those voices seemed louder, filled with tension and excitement, carrying words she did not fully understand but sensed were important. Words like millions, shares, and signatures, repeated often enough to catch her attention, and as executives hurried past her corner, speaking into their phones or whispering to each other, she began piecing together fragments, hearing mentions of a deal that everyone seemed desperate to complete, their tones both proud and urgent. Her young mind, sharp with curiosity, noticed that some of the voices carried confidence, while others carried hesitation, as though a few were not entirely convinced, but dared not say it too loudly. And this subtle difference made her lean in ever so slightly, straining to hear more, her heartbeat quickening with each new word. From where she sat, she could see the open boardroom door when people entered and left, carrying thick folders and flashing quick smiles that did not quite reach their eyes. And though she could not see the papers, she heard enough to sense that something about this deal was more complicated than it seemed, and unlike the adults who brushed past details in their rush, she clung to them, repeating the words in her head like puzzle pieces she wanted to fit together. The longer she listened, the stronger her curiosity grew, because while everyone seemed blinded by excitement, she picked up a nervous laugh here, a hushed warning there, little cracks in the perfect picture being painted, and it gave her a strange feeling she could not explain, a mix of fear and determination, as if she had stumbled upon something secret that no one else dared to notice. And though she was only a child, her silence and sharp attention made her the only one who was truly listening to the things that mattered, a quiet witness to whispers that hinted at danger hiding in plain sight. The girl shifted in her seat, her school books now forgotten, as her eyes followed the movement inside the boardroom, where papers were being passed around with a kind of ceremony. Executives leaning forward with eager smiles, pointing at slides on a glowing screen, their voices smooth and confident as they praised the brilliance of the deal. Yet to her curious eyes, something looked off, though she could not quite name it at first. She caught sight of one thick document that had been left near the edge of the long polished table, and while no one paid attention to her small figure in the corner, she could see enough of the pages to notice that the rows of numbers, though neatly typed, did not line up the way they should, a few totals jumping strangely higher than the rest, as if someone had added too much but tried to hide it among long lists. Even more unsettling was a particular clause, a paragraph that appeared more than once in the paperwork, not copied exactly word for word but repeated with slight changes, subtle enough that a busy reader might think it normal, but obvious enough for her young, careful eyes to catch, and she found herself staring at it, feeling a ripple of unease that grew stronger the more she looked. The adults in the room seemed blind to it, clapping at every slide, nodding quickly at every explanation, too eager to sign the dotted line. But the girl's attention clung stubbornly to those mismatched numbers and that repeating section, because it didn't look like a mistake. It looked like something meant to confuse, to slip by unnoticed in the sea of words. And though she was no expert, her heart told her it mattered. She wondered if she was imagining things. Yet each time she blinked her eyes back to the page, the pattern remained, stubborn and sharp against the otherwise neat layout, and a chill passed over her, because if she, a child, could see it so clearly, how had none of the adults seen it, or had they seen and chosen to stay quiet? The thought made her stomach twist, and suddenly the proud voices in the boardroom sounded less like celebration and more like a trap being set, a game in which only a few knew the rules, while the rest cheered without realizing the danger. She pressed her fingers against her books, grounding herself, her mind racing, caught between fear and a strange sense of responsibility that told her this was not something to ignore, because the odd numbers and repeating clause weren't accidents, they were signals, hidden signs that someone had buried something dangerous inside the deal, and she had been the only one to notice. The girl clutched her books tightly to her chest as she gathered the courage to approach one of the employees who passed by. her small voice, careful but firm, as she explained that something in the papers didn't look right, that the numbers didn't match, and the clause had been repeated strangely. Yet instead of concern, the man only gave her a kind smile, the type adults often gave children when they thought their imagination was running wild, and with a gentle pat on her shoulder he said she was too young to understand complicated business matters, assuring her everything had already been checked many times. But the words did not calm her, because she knew what she saw. And as she tried again with another worker, she received the same polite dismissal, their faces friendly but their eyes distracted, as though they were too focused on the promise of success to even consider her warning. And each rejection made her heart sink deeper, for she wasn't seeking attention, she was trying to protect them from something she felt growing heavier, the more she thought about it. The closer the hour of signing came, the louder the chatter in the boardroom grew, laughter echoing against the glass walls, executives shaking hands, their pens ready, and though she stood just a few steps away, it felt like a wall had risen between her and them, a wall made of disbelief, pride, and hurry. Her unease only sharpened, her eyes darting to the glowing digital clock on the wall that counted down the minutes until the deal was official, and she felt trapped between her knowledge and their blindness, her small voice swallowed by their certainty. She wondered if she should give up, but each time she tried to turn away, the mismatched numbers returned to her mind, and the repeated clause flashed in her thoughts like a warning signal she could not ignore, and though she had no proof beyond her sharp memory and careful eyes, something inside whispered that if the papers were signed, the company would lose far more than money. It would lose trust, safety, and perhaps even its future. Still, the employees brushed past her with polite nods, their smiles hiding impatience, treating her concern as nothing more than a child's curiosity, and she felt the weight of being unheard pressed down hard, knowing she had only moments left before the truth would be sealed away under a line of ink. The girl sat quietly in the corner, her small hands gripping the edges of her books, her heart pounding faster as the sound of voices and laughter filled the boardroom. The deal just minutes away from being signed, and yet her mind kept circling back to her mother's words, spoken so many times at home in their tiny kitchen. Never stay silent when you see something wrong. Those words had always sounded simple when her mother said them, like advice for everyday life, but now they felt heavier, as though they had been meant for this very moment, and the girl realized with a jolt that silence would mean allowing a mistake, maybe even a betrayal, to slip past unnoticed. Fear pressed against her chest because she was only a maid's daughter, a child with no authority in a room full of powerful adults. But courage began to build slowly, like a flame refusing to go out, reminding her that the truth mattered more than her fear. She thought carefully, recalling every detail she had noticed, the mismatched numbers that didn't align, the repeated clause that hid something dangerous, and the way the papers seemed designed to confuse rather than explain. And she began to shape her thoughts in clear, simple words that even the busiest mind could not ignore. Around her, the room grew busier, pens being clicked open, glasses of water placed on the long table, handshakes exchanged, and yet she sat still, her silence no longer born from doubt but from preparation, from the decision that she would speak at exactly the right moment. Her mother's figure appeared in the doorway, moving with her quiet steps as she carried supplies. Unaware of the storm in her daughter's chest, and seeing her gave the girl strength, reminding her who she was and why she couldn't turn away. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, rehearsing her words in her head one last time, and though her hands trembled slightly, her eyes grew firm with resolve. If no one believed her before, then she would speak loudly enough for them to stop and listen, even if only for a moment, because that moment could save everything. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders, but she did not bend under it. Instead, she straightened, her small frame steady, her mind clear, and as the executives leaned over the contracts, smiling at the promise of $500 million, The girl silently vowed she would not let the ink touch the paper without the truth being heard. The moment hung heavy in the room, pens lifted like weapons, ready to seal fate. When the maid's daughter took a trembling step forward, her small shoes clicking softly against the polished floor, pulling every gaze toward her. At first, no one understood what she was doing. A child standing among powerful men and women in their suits. But her voice, though nervous, broke the silence with a firmness no one expected. She raised her hand toward the stack of papers on the glossy table and, in the simplest words she knew, pointed out the repeated clause, the one she had studied over and over in her mind until it burned like a warning. Her words were clear, not full of business terms or technical explanations, but plain and direct, and that was what made the executives pause. Their smiles faltered, the sound of laughter died, and the scratching of pens stilled as they leaned closer to the pages in front of them. Frowns replaced their earlier excitement, and eyes shifted uneasily, scanning line by line, finally noticing what had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. A heavy silence followed her explanation, broken only by the rustle of papers being flipped, and for the first time that day, doubt entered the room like a shadow. The girl's heart hammered, but she stood steady, her voice softer now, almost apologetic, yet carrying the weight of truth as she repeated what she had seen. Numbers that didn't add up, a clause that should never have been doubled, and a pattern too strange to ignore. The CEO, who had boasted proudly just moments earlier, now tightened his jaw, confusion and irritation flickering across his face as he turned to his team, demanding explanations with his eyes. The executives whispered among themselves, their once confident tone replaced by uncertainty, and the girl, though frightened, watched them carefully, knowing her words had cracked the surface of the deal. No one spoke loudly at first, as if embarrassed that it was a child who had noticed what they had missed, but slowly the room shifted. Suspicion replacing pride, fear overtaking certainty. The pens were set down on the table, the contract no longer shining with promise, but trembling under doubt. The daughter stood silently now, her duty done, her chest rising and falling quickly as she fought the urge to retreat back into the safety of the corner. Yet her eyes never left the table, where millions of lives and jobs depended on the truth being seen. What had seemed like a harmless interruption was no longer small. It was the turning point, and though she was only the maid's daughter, her voice had stopped a $500 million mistake in its tracks, leaving the entire room staring at the papers with new, uneasy suspicion. The lawyers moved quickly, their hands almost trembling as they pulled the contracts closer, flipping page after page with sharp movements that filled the silence of the boardroom. At first, they wore the same expressions of doubt many others had, convinced that the girl's interruption had been nothing more than a child's imagination. But as their eyes scanned deeper, something shifted. Their confident faces grew pale, their brows furrowed, and the soft murmurs between them grew louder, more frantic, as if they had uncovered a snake coiled within the very words of the document. One lawyer tapped the paper repeatedly, his finger landing on the clause the girl had pointed out, and suddenly all of them leaned in, whispering in urgent tones that carried the weight of alarm. The executives watched closely, unease spreading like fire through the room, while the girl stood quietly, hugging her books to her chest, unsure if she had gone too far or not far enough. Finally, one of the lawyers looked up, his voice steady but heavy with disbelief as he explained what they had just found. The repeated clause wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, hidden among layers of confusing language designed to distract the reader. If signed, the deal would have triggered a silent transfer of millions into accounts that were not part of the company, draining funds in a way so subtle that it might never have been noticed until it was far too late. Gasps echoed through the boardroom, chairs shifted back, and the proud confidence of earlier vanished in an instant, replaced with fear and anger. The CEO's face stiffened, his jaw clenched, and for the first time his voice wavered as he demanded to know how this had slipped past every pair of professional eyes in the room. The lawyers did not answer, their silence proof enough of their shock and shame. The daughter's discovery had shattered the illusion of security, and now the reality of a massive scam stood exposed, its danger undeniable. Employees exchanged glances, whispers rising again, not of dismissal this time but of awe and respect for the young girl who had spoken up when no one else did. The girl remained still, her heart pounding in her chest, realizing now the full weight of what she had uncovered. She had not only saved her mother's company, but also protected countless jobs and futures tied to it. The boardroom, moments ago, ready to celebrate, now sat in stunned silence, the papers before them no longer a deal of pride, but a weapon almost turned against them. And at the center of it all stood the maid's daughter, the one no one had noticed, whose quiet courage had revealed the truth that might have cost them everything. The boardroom, once buzzing with celebration and overconfidence, now felt heavy with silence as every eye shifted toward the young girl who had dared to interrupt the most important meeting of the year. The CEO, who earlier had walked past her without so much as a glance, now found himself staring at her as though seeing her for the very first time. His face, usually firm and unreadable, softened with something gratitude mixed with awe. He realized that this quiet child had done what none of his highly paid experts had managed. She had saved the company from walking straight into a trap that would have destroyed its future. For a long moment, no one spoke, but the weight of respect was thick in the air, and the girl, clutching her books tightly, shifted uneasily under the sudden attention. She had not acted for recognition. She had only remembered her mother's words about speaking up when something was wrong. And yet, here she stood, the center of a story that would be told for years to come. At the edge of the room, her mother, the maid who had walked those halls unnoticed for years, stood with tears in her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away, unwilling to break the dignity of the moment. Her heart swelled with pride, not only because her daughter had proven her sharp mind, but because she had shown courage that many adults in the room had lacked. Executives who had dismissed the girl earlier now avoided each other's gaze, ashamed that they had silenced the truth when it first appeared in such simple words. Whispers began to ripple around the table, not of doubt, but of admiration, as if the entire company's future now rested on the courage of a single voice. The CEO finally rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, and in front of everyone, he spoke directly to the child. His tone carried none of the arrogance that usually colored his words. Instead, it was calm, sincere, and humble. He thanked her for saving them from disaster, admitting openly that without her, the deal would have ruined everything they had built. His words carried more than gratitude. They carried respect, the kind that could not be faked. The girl's cheeks flushed, her small frame trembling slightly under the weight of so many eyes. But her gaze was steady, her silence dignified. Around her, the staff began to nod, acknowledging her in ways they had never done before. Their earlier condescension replaced with admiration. Her mother, still standing by the door, held her hands together tightly, as though holding her heart in place, her pride almost too great to contain. In that moment, the maid was no longer just invisible staff, and her daughter no longer just a quiet child in the corner. They had become the reason a company worth millions still stood unbroken. The respect earned that day was more powerful than the money almost lost, and it lingered in every corner of the room. The story of the maid's daughter traveled far beyond the walls of the company, carried first by whispers among employees, then by news outlets that eagerly shared the astonishing tale of how a quiet child had saved millions from slipping into the hands of clever fraudsters. People found it almost unbelievable a young girl, unnoticed and underestimated, had seen what lawyers, executives, and advisors had missed. The more it spread, the more it became not just a tale of numbers and contracts, but a reminder of something deeper, Wisdom can appear in unexpected places, and respect should never be tied to wealth, power, or title. In schools, teachers told the story to remind students that even their smallest observations could make a difference. In offices, managers repeated it as a lesson in humility, warning that ignoring a simple truth because of who spoke it could lead to disaster. For the CEO and his board, the event changed how they looked at every person around them, from the interns to the cleaning staff. The girl, once overlooked, was invited to speak to groups who wanted to hear how she had the courage to step forward when it mattered most, though she often reminded them that her mother's advice had been her true guide. As for her mother, she no longer walked through the tall glass building unseen. Her quiet steps now carried a quiet respect from all who passed, as if her years of unnoticed service had finally been acknowledged through her daughter's bravery. Yet, more than money saved or contracts rewritten, the real value of the story lay in the shift it created in people's hearts. Those who heard it began to ask themselves whether they too had ignored voices around them, whether they had dismissed truths simply because they came from someone without status or power. The story lived on, not as a corporate event, but as a timeless lesson, a reminder that courage, honesty, and wisdom can rise from anywhere, even from the daughter of a maid sitting quietly in a corner with her. And so, long after the contracts were corrected and the scam exposed, the memory of that moment remained alive, turning into a lesson passed from one person to another. Never underestimate the value of a voice, no matter how small, and never forget that respect is not earned by titles, but by the truth we dare to speak.